So, quick refresher. Last Sunday we were talking about the Gospels. We've been talking about historical evidence for Jesus and for the resurrection. We went through some of the reasons to believe why the Gospels are a very recent account, and if we remember some of the historical criteria that we talked about, something that is written recently to the events they describe is often a marker of there's a very good chance that the person who wrote it is closely tied to the events or may have been an eyewitness of those events. We talked about how the content of the Gospels, the details and the names and places, reflect an author who is intimately knowledgeable about first century Palestine. These are not works that were written after the fact to try to create a story or fabricate a narrative. They really read more like eyewitness accounts. And even where they differ, it's not in a way that derails the doctrine of Christianity. It doesn't derail our faith, but rather the differences between the Gospels help to highlight the fact that these were different authors and they may have written in a somewhat slightly different voice. What we then turned our attention to was looking at Paul. And I wanted to spend a little more time on this first this evening, is looking at Paul. We talked about Paul as being a evidence in himself in some ways, because Paul was so persuaded of Christianity, yet he was so opposed to it early on. And Paul did not have a secular reason to want to sign up with these Christians. He didn't have any kind of financial motive or influential motive. He didn't really seek a higher station in life by becoming a Christian. In fact, Paul gave up most of the status that he had in the act of believing Christ and becoming a Christian. So it wasn't for personal gain, and it took something really substantial for him to turn on a dime like that. Paul wasn't a vulnerable person who was an easy target for a cult. He was a very reasoned individual who came to this conclusion on what we have to conclude is very insurmountable evidence. Witnessing the resurrected Christ to Paul was insurmountable evidence. That was the thing that persuaded him, and that was the thing that made him so assured that he was certain of the resurrection. So I wanted to branch off of that here this evening. Turn to 1 Corinthians 15, if you would. We're going to look at something that Paul wrote about the resurrection, because some skeptics of the Gospels and some critics of the Gospels say that, well, the Gospels came later, they were written after the fact, and this whole resurrection thing was added into the story to try to make Jesus seem more significant. Basically, the miracles and the resurrection, they were added details that the early Christians made up as myths so that more people would believe in Jesus and that it would make him seem more powerful than he was. Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 15, makes it absolutely clear about the truth and the reality of the resurrection, not as mythology, but as an event that really took place. He says in the beginning of chapter 15, "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received." So, pausing there for a moment, there Paul is, to point to the historical nature of this letter, the gospel, remember, was delivered orally first. The gospel was delivered by spoken word of the preachers who came and set up churches in the cities, in this case Corinth. So the Corinthians heard the gospel, not the books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the message from the preachers who came. He says, "The gospel that I preached to you, which you received, and in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance that what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James," that being James, the brother of Jesus, "and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed." We'll pause there for a little bit. Just any thoughts or comments there about the tone of voice that Paul is assuming here? Does this sound like Paul is trying to reaffirm a mythological story or relate an event that happened recently? recent event. Thank you, Samantha. Clearly, Paul is saying here, this is just what happened. That Christ did die, that he was buried, and that he did rise again on the third day. It's inescapable, and it's very unequivocally clear what Paul believes here. I was taking some notes from one of the books I was looking at. This is from Doy Moore's book. He says that some skeptics must deny the Gospels as being late, which is debatable, but they cannot dismiss Paul as a separate, independent, and early source for the resurrection. It would be hard-pressed to deny Paul's historical intent. So here saying that there's almost no other way to interpret that Paul is telling a story here, or that he's being allegorical or metaphorical. This is pretty clearly stated as history. And Paul says that it is of first importance to the faith. Continuing on in verse 12. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. And if in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. So, just very, very clear here that Paul is making it clear that the resurrection is key to our faith, that the resurrection is a real event, and that he was a witness to the resurrected Christ. And he cites here more than 500 others, as well as the apostles and the brother of Jesus, those who saw him after his death. Paul is calling out all these people. And something that I came across, which was an interesting thought, Paul writes this so soon after the events that took place. It's about AD 50 or 40 or so. This is maybe 10 to 20 years after the resurrection when Paul writes this. It is so soon that there were enough people still living that if Paul is making this up, they could invalidate his claims. If Paul is falsifying the story about the resurrection, there are those who can say, no, I saw Jesus be crucified and he did not reappear. I saw his body go into the tomb and the apostles made this story up. But you don't find that. You don't see the church fizzling out because of people invalidating the story of the resurrection. The growth of the church itself is in itself a form of evidence for the validity of this message. The number of people who believed in the resurrection, it caught on very, very quickly as far as historical movements go. And it was believed by a diverse group of people from a very early stage. And this is an important point. Mythologies form very slowly, and they form over generations of stories being told. And mythologies tend to be believed by a related group of people, similar culture, similar background, similar ethnicity. Typically, mythologies kind of run alongside bloodlines of people. But in the case of Jesus' resurrection, he's believed by Jews, he's believed by Greeks, he's believed by former pagans. You think about in Acts chapter 2 or 3, all of the languages that are referenced, all of the cultures that are referenced. Stan talked about this last week. The number and the diversity of people who believe the resurrection from a very early onset is further evidence to it not being just a made-up mythology. If this was a sect of Judaism that branched off and then became a little cult of its own, it would be very similar. The people who would be a part of it would be very similar. They would be Jewish by heritage. But it's not that. You don't see that being the case. I brought Doy Moore's book with me. This was loaned to me by Jeff, so this is from his library. But I wanted to just go over one more point about Paul, and then we'll move on to some of the extra biblical evidences. He writes about the details that Paul knew about Jesus' life. And just let me read this passage for you. He includes references. I'll mention those just so that we have those stated for the record. He says, what does Paul indicate that he knew about Jesus Christ in the epistles, and why is Paul's knowledge important for understanding the historical Jesus? Paul knew that Jesus was an Israelite of the tribe of David. He says this in Romans 1:3, 9:5, and Galatians 3:16. He knew that Jesus was born under the law, Galatians 4:4. Jesus had a brother named James, Galatians 1:19. to whom he appeared living, 1 Corinthians 15. We just read that. Jesus also had other brothers, 1 Corinthians 9:5. Paul knew that Jesus was poor, 2 Corinthians 8:9. That he ministered among Jews, Romans 15:8. That he had 12 chosen men to serve with him, 1 Corinthians 15:5. And Paul knew that Peter was married, and Jesus knew, 1 Corinthians 9:5. He knew that Jesus had instituted a Lord's Supper and knew the words that Jesus used in giving instructions for it before his betrayal night, 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 25. Paul knew that Jesus was betrayed, 1 Corinthians 11:23, killed by crucifixion, 1 Corinthians 1:17. And that his execution came about by the influence of his own countrymen, 1 Thessalonians 2:14, that he was buried and seen again alive, 1 Corinthians 15. Critics think they can know almost nothing concerning the life and the personality of Jesus. But Paul concludes from his knowledge that Jesus is Lord. There's more. What did Paul know about the character of Jesus? He knew that Jesus was meek and gentle, 2 Corinthians 10:1. He understood that Jesus was humble, self-sacrificing, and obedient to the Father, even unto death on the cross, Philippians 2:6 and Romans 5:19. He knew Jesus' life and death was characterized by grace and love, 2 Corinthians 8:9 and Romans 8:35. Paul also knew that Jesus was righteous, even saying that Jesus knew no sin, Romans 5:18 and 2 Corinthians 5:21. Paul saw the life of Christ as one to be emulated, 1 Corinthians 11:1. He was practicing what he knew was at the heart of the gospel, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. Paul knew the historical Jesus well, and he called upon Christians to follow Christ's example. So I just wanted to read through that because the number of references there to Paul's knowledge about Jesus. Now Paul didn't meet Jesus while he was living on earth, right? And he didn't see all those things for himself. We understand from studying the nature of Revelation and the fact that Paul was also told things to say and knew things to write down through the Holy Spirit. And no doubt he also heard these things through the gospel when he had it preached to him. Paul had to go to Cornelius after seeing Jesus, and he still learned the full nature of the story. He heard all the rest of everything he needed to hear. But he gets the details right. He gets all those things correct, and those are confirmed, they're corroborated by the gospel accounts as independent people also writing down their version of events, and it matches. Paul doesn't get the story wrong, even though he's writing. Remember, he's writing before he has the Gospels. So the Gospels are written down later. Paul's not cheating and just copying down what he read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The closeness of Paul to the events that he's describing and the details with which Paul understands the life of Christ all lend credence to Paul being a writer who was an eyewitness. And if Paul is an eyewitness, then 1 Corinthians 15 becomes exceedingly important because he's writing this as someone who knows. He's not writing this as someone who just thinks that the resurrection is important. He's writing this as from a position of authority on the matter because he has seen it and he knows it through the Holy Spirit. So I just wanted to go through some of those other details about Paul as I think a very strong piece of evidence for the historical nature of Jesus. Were there any other thoughts about Paul or Paul's writings that people wanted to make a note of, or any comments people wanted to bring out? Okay. Well, we'll move on then to what if we don't trust the Bible? Okay. What if the Bible's just a bunch of stories? We've already looked at a lot of reasons to say that's not a very reasonable position to take, but let's push that aside for now. I asked you all to research, and you've had now about 2 weeks to do so, research some of the extra biblical mentions of Jesus or the resurrection. What observations do you make about the historical mentions of Jesus? So I'm asking for things that are not in the Bible now. What were you able to find?
Say external. I would say one of the proofs would be the number of copies of the scriptures that exist back, from AD 70.
Okay. So that being the number of copies of the early New Testament being sort of a proof from the text itself, not necessarily from the content of the text, but from just the physical nature of the accuracy of the copies that we have. I think that's strong evidence, at least for the fact that the scriptures were revered and that the New Testament was held in high regard in how it was copied. That does lend credence to the belief of those who were doing the copying, the dedication they had to the role of copying and spreading those letters. So I think that's one. Josephus, okay. I think he's on my list here. I actually found this article and printed it out. I found this one kind of helpful because not only does it list the individuals, but it also gives the actual quotes from their writings of what they say. Sometimes we talk about these characters, but we don't always talk about the things that they wrote. Did you have a quote from Josephus or something that he said?
I had something here, he was, and it talks about the Christ, and when Pilate at the suggestion of principal men among us had condemned him to the, no, that's not it. I don't have anything.
That's okay. I've got a couple quotes pulled out here. So some background. Josephus was a Jewish Roman historian, and he made a famous reference to Jesus in the work that he wrote. He wrote a book called The Antiquities of the Jews. So he was writing a history book, basically, about the period of time during Augustus's reign and onward. He wrote about AD 93, it's believed. And in this work, what's interesting here, this article notes that most scholars, Christian and non-Christian, agree that the passage in its Greek form had been altered by a Christian scribe at some point in antiquity, but later in the 1970s there was an Arabic version of the passage found that did not contain those alterations, and this is what it said. It says, quote, "At this time there was a wise man whose name was Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." So a couple notes about this. Well, I'll throw it out to you all instead of just saying it. Hearing that quote from Josephus, remember, he's not a Christian individual. He is a Roman and a Jew, dual citizenship, Jew and Roman. What do you note about the things that he says about Jesus in his book? Do you see any kind of bias or maybe editorial comments about Jesus? Go ahead, Brace.
The only things that might lend themselves to some kind of editorial bias really are more observations about how other people viewed him, not how Josephus himself saw him.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be in the things that he records a lack of personal bias, really just trying to report the facts as he saw them. And I think it's significant that he identifies Jesus as a man
Mm-hmm.
who lived during that time period, whose followers viewed him as highly significant. He saw virtuousness in his character, at least whether he did or not, others did. And he recognized the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, which is historically significant because that is an agreement, even though it's an external source from a non-sympathetic, perhaps, voice, expresses the same facts that we find recorded in the Gospels.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. Josephus is fairly objective in how he describes Jesus. If you were trying to write like a Wikipedia article about Jesus as a historical figure, it might sound a little bit like this. He talks about, he was known to be virtuous. People among the Jews and from other nations became his disciples. He does acknowledge a couple key things that Josephus acknowledges. One, he doesn't question the validity of Jesus as being a real person. That's unquestionable from his writing. So there was someone named Jesus. He doesn't dispute the events of the crucifixion or the events of his ministry and the fact that he amassed a following. And then he says that they reported, or it was reported by his disciples, that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion. So what's important from this passage is it's an early extra-biblical mention of the resurrection being a key aspect of the Christian faith and of Christian disciples. Paul Mayer, in this article, he's another historian, he's quoted as saying, clearly this version of the passage is expressed. Remember, this is from the Arabic version that wasn't edited. The edit that was made in the Greek version, by the way, it's believed there was a Christian scholar who edited the Greek version, and he edited it to say something along the lines of that Jesus was the Christ, I think was inserted there. The Arabic version doesn't have it, and he says that it's expressed in a manner appropriate to a non-Christian Jew, and it corresponds almost precisely to previous scholarly projections of what Josephus had actually written. He does say that there's a later description in the book, just a quick mention, where he says, he describes the death of James, who he calls the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. So he does use the word Christ just as a reference to how he was known, not necessarily that Josephus is using that term himself. But AD 93, pretty early as far as ancient writers go. A pretty good example there of not a Christian and not a biblical author still corroborating the things that exist in the scriptures. Other examples. Did anyone else find other authors or other examples from history where Jesus is mentioned early on?
Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, dated between 55 and 120 AD, is identified by many as the greatest historian of ancient Rome. Doesn't mention Jesus per se, but when he wrote of the reign of Nero, he mentions one named Christus, who was the founder of a movement, who was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius, which again is not only a specific found in the New Testament, but a good outside witness. And then he identifies the fact that this one was responsible for this movement that began first in Judea and then spread further and ultimately even reached the city of Rome. And so, again, though that's not the intent, it inadvertently describes a process that we see in the book of Acts transpiring, that it began in Judea first and then moved from there to other parts of the world and ultimately to Rome. So,
Right.
I mean, it's historically a historically verified fact by an outside source who was non-sympathetic.
Yes. Tacitus, I don't know how to say his name. I think it says that in the passage where that mention comes from, it's believed to have been written around AD 116, which fits within that range that you gave. He wrote two major books, one called the Histories and one called the Annals, and he was trying to just cover different periods of history of Rome. The interesting thing about his quote, I don't know if you read the actual text of what he wrote, he is not sympathetic to Christians at all. Tacitus says very negative things about them. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, this is quoting Tacitus, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. He says later that he mentions Christus, from whom the name had its origin. He suffered the extreme penalty. Most scholars think that's referencing crucifixion. He suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, but the first source of the evil, but also even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So not only is he critical of Christianity, but he's throwing in a little bit of his own opinions about the state of Rome at the time when he was writing. He's like, oh, it's just a cesspool. You know, Rome is just, ugh. All these superstitions find their foothold in Rome. And some scholars have suggested that superstition, or as he calls it, a mischievous superstition that Tacitus is writing about, is resurrection from the dead. In the Roman religions, that was not something that was not something that was very kosher to talk about in the Roman pagan religions. The idea of God raising, coming as a man and raising from the dead was offensive to the nations of Rome and to the Roman faith or faiths. So another source there, AD 116, not supportive of Christians. He's not on the side of Christians, but he's not denying anything that the Bible talks about. He's not saying anything that doesn't match with the Bible account, just to give more credence to the fact that these events most likely took place in history. They're real events. Were there any others that people found that were noteworthy?
There's an article, 10 historical references of Jesus outside the Bible.
I think that's what I'm holding
Okay.
in my hand.
Number 5, Mara Bar Serapon, does it in his letter to his son when he's in prison. He doesn't reference Jesus directly, but he does in there talk about the wise king that the Jews killed.
Right. Yes, he's writing about, I forget what the context for this one particularly was. He's encouraging his son to pursue wisdom, and he uses the Jews as an analogy in his letter. So he says, look at the Jews. He says, what advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates, for which they were repaid with famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because their country was completely covered in sand in just an hour? Or the Jews by killing their wise king, because their kingdom was taken away at that very time? God justly repaid the wisdom of these 3 men. The Athenians died of famine, the Samians were completely overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, are scattered through every nation. Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new laws he laid down. So the 2 mentions of Jesus there are, he was known to this author as a king of the Jews, which is interesting because from the gospel accounts we know that at his crucifixion, that was written above Jesus when he was being crucified. So a independent observer, not knowing anything about who Jesus was or not knowing anything about Christianity, could still see that and think, oh, some Jewish person is trying to start an insurrection, some Jewish person tried to overthrow Rome, and now he's being crucified for it. So the Jews had a hand in it, so they rejected their king. And if you walked away from that situation and then wrote about it later to your son in a letter, you might say the Jews killed their own wise king. So that was mentioned. And that was written in AD 73. So this came around about the same time or even before some of the time when the Gospels may have finally been put to pen. Probably later by about 10 years or so, but obviously not referencing the Gospels in any way. Let me see here if there's any others that I liked from this list. Now that I know that Aaron has the same article as me, I'm sweating because he's just going to steal all my notes. I
don't know if these are on the list or not, but there are at least 4 2nd century emperors who, perhaps not through their own writings, but through the writings of various historians during that time period, they allude to the fact that those emperors were concerned about Christians, and they identify some of the same kinds of facts. Pliny the Younger is one of the ones who mentions Trajan, who was emperor during the first part of the 2nd century. And then Hadrian, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, which were the first 4 of the 2nd century, all seem to have spoken to various people about their concern concerning this group of Christians who had originated in Judea. And so, again, not a sympathetic source at that point.
Right.
In fact, they were persecuting Christians pretty heavily by the beginning of the 2nd century.
I cannot remember now where I actually came across it, but I believe there were no less than 7 emperors in the time period who, at some point in their correspondence that's been archived and was preserved during their emperorship, the idea or the notion of Christians came across their desk, so to speak. I believe the number was 7. So what does that go to show? What do you think? What is significant from that?
Well, I mean, again, it's just a non-sympathetic voice who is identifying a movement that is very much identified in the New Testament. And a lot of the details that they give are significant because they match what we find in the New Testament concerning the days that they met, what their assemblies were like. Some characteristics of their assemblies are mentioned. The characteristics of the people themselves. And it doesn't appear, at least from most of the writings I saw, or references that I saw, that they were concerned because these were a riotous bunch of people who were creating an insurrection so much as it was just that this movement was gaining such ground
Right.
that they were afraid perhaps of what the result would be and where this whole thing was going. But I don't know. I found some of the comments that were made about them, or some of the remarks that they had made, significant because they match what we find in the New Testament, whether it's in Acts or the epistles regarding the early church. And so Pliny the Younger was one of the ones I mentioned. The other one was...
I found here the reference that Pliny writes about. It includes those details of what the early church looked like from an outside observer's perspective. It's kind of interesting. He's writing a letter to Trajan because Trajan asked him for... Pliny was a Roman governor, and Trajan was asking for advice on how should I deal with these Christians? What do you think I should do with them? And so Pliny just writes about them. They say they all worshipped... Others whose names were given to me by an informer first said that they were Christians and then afterward denied it, declaring that they had been but were no longer so. Some of them recanted after many years, and more than one so long as 20 years back. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the deities, and they cursed the name of Christ. So he starts the letter by saying, some of them turned back, some of them recanted. And he says, but they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had become accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god. And that so far from binding themselves by oath not to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when later called upon to deliver it. So what he's doing is he's writing about Christians who he had accused before and the things that they said in their defense, that they hadn't really done anything that was against the law. He was saying, these Christians, this is what they do. They meet on a certain day. They sing these hymns to Christ as though he were a god. I think that's an interesting detail, that the nature of worship of Jesus exists very early in the church. Pliny's writing at about 112 AD when he says this. So the deity of Christ exists very, very early in the church. And that he says, they're committed to these upstanding conduct was kind of the whole notion of the quote is, if they're guilty of anything, this is what they say they're guilty of. This is what they do. Just a couple more, and then we'll move on here. There was one that I found, Phlegon, who we don't have his writings. He is one of these historians who's quoted by another historian, Origen. Origen cites Phlegon in reference to Jesus. He says, now Phlegon in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the results corresponded to his predictions. And with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place, Phlegon too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his Chronicles. So here is a historian quoting a former historian. He writes his work in about AD 140. He's quoting another historian who mentions an eclipse. So he doesn't know what to attribute the darkness to, and he calls it an eclipse. And he mentions great earthquakes, and he makes reference to prophecies and predictions that Jesus made that came true. So all of those things were known to an outside observer recently after those events. The last one I think that we'll do is Thallus. He writes AD 55. This article cites him as perhaps the earliest non-Christian writer to refer to Jesus. And his works have been lost, but he was quoted by Julius Africanus in AD 220. And in that book, Thallus is quoted as saying, on the whole world there were pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So Julius Africanus is trying to make sense of the things that Thallus says he observed in AD 55. The article also goes on to say this reference is important because it likely predates the writing of most of the Gospels themselves. So Thallus is not trying to retroactively explain something that the Gospels claimed. He's just reporting on what happened without knowing that that was part of what would eventually be the Gospels.
It should be pointed out that there were astrologists, is that the right word? Astronomists who did predict eclipses and knew the pattern and habits of the planets. They may not have understood orbits altogether, but they could time these things. And what's interesting about the writing is that what made it so frightful, it was totally unexpected. They already had the cycles of different eclipses down in their books. They knew when to expect these things.
Right. There were, I don't know how far all of the astronomy science was in the time of Rome, but I know that it wasn't unknown to them. There certainly were other ancient cultures that understood those patterns pretty well as well. But you're right in that it was of note to these historians because it wasn't on the books. You know, this wasn't one of the eclipses that should have been routine or should have been expected by their stargazers. So that's a good point as well. And the fact that it appears in both Phlegon and Thallus' writing independently of each other, it seems like it caught a lot of people's attention. Okay, any other comments before we go? We've only got about 5 more minutes, but I want to try to cover the back of this sheet because I put some statements down and I want you to try to tell me, what would you say, now that we know kind of, we've digested some of this information, we've got extra biblical evidence, we've got evidence from the biblical text. Try to practice putting that into a sentence or two that you would say in response to these. So, a person says to you, Jesus wasn't a real person. He's just a myth like Hercules or Paul Bunyan. What would you say to someone who says Jesus was not a real person?
There were several historians that wrote about him, of his existence.
Right. The historical man, Jesus, is well confirmed by historians and Christian writers alike. But the fact that these historians, they have no reason to recount this individual. They have no reason to record him in history other than he was someone who led a movement of people in Judea at that time. It made the news, so to speak. It made the history books. I think that's probably where I would turn to first is, as far as him being just a real person, there's almost no secular scholar, atheist or not, who would say that there wasn't someone named Jesus, that there wasn't a person who existed who fits that description. So the next statement, maybe, okay, well, Jesus was a real person, but he was just a human. Everything supernatural about Jesus was made up after the fact by Christians. How do we know that the Bible isn't just made up? That the early Christians just said, okay, we need to make him sound better, so let's throw some miracles in there, let's throw the resurrection in there. He got crucified, it didn't work out so well, but we gotta make something of this.
Would it make any sense that people went to their death declaring the veracity of the scripture?
I think there's an element to that. We talked about that a few days ago, but I wanted to come back to it. The fact that they were so fervent that they would die for this message, is that proof of the validity of the message? I think, what do you think?
It's proof of their conviction.
Okay. I think that's a fair distinction to make. It's not necessarily proof that the thing the person is dying for is true, but it is proof that the person is convinced. And that goes actually to the next point. Let's talk about that one too. The resurrection didn't happen. His followers faked the event to create a story and make people believe them. The apostles were liars. The fact that they would go to their deaths for a lie, I think there is some convincing. There is a convincing thought there that maybe a believer who didn't see the events themselves and they're told these things, they can attain a faith that they will die for. People have died before for things that are not true. They've been misled and they'll still die for those beliefs. But the people who perpetrated the beliefs, the person who started the lie, knows that it's a lie. So if their life is on the line and they know they're lying, people are not likely to still go to their grave for a knowable lie. If someone is just a follower, they don't know that it's a lie, they may be more likely to stick it out and not recant. But I think there's reason to believe that the apostles wouldn't want to die for it, because if they knew they were lying, they know. They made it up. The guilt, I think one of the sources I was looking at talked about how the guilt would be too much, that it'd be too much for them to bear. I think it was William Lane that I was reading who said something to that effect. Yeah, I won't waste time on that right now. There's another thing I would say too to this notion that the apostles were liars. And I heard that bell and it just went right out of my head.
Well, there's writings to the churches that are within less than 20 years of the events of the crucifixion. You're writing to a group of people that were alive on the earth at that time. They're going to know pretty quickly whether he's telling a tale or not.
Right.
They're there to see it.
Right. There's a whole host of opportunity for the lie to be exposed. If you're trying to, think about it. If you're trying to perpetrate a lie that someone had risen from the dead, well, if you're the Jewish leaders, how do you squash that lie really quickly?
Present a body.
You procure the body, and the Jewish leaders were unable to do that. That helped the question of, well, what happened to the body become a lot more difficult. So then then you have to go through all these theories of, well, they stole the body, or they were able to do that. And not only did the gospel accounts make it clear that would have been a very difficult task for the apostles to try to undertake, it also doesn't match with what's recorded about the apostles, that they too were skeptical of the resurrection. The apostles did not think it was going to happen. They did not think that this was something that they had to do in order to, we have to dig him up to prove that his prophecies were true. They weren't even convinced when people told them that he was raised. So the apostles were skeptical themselves. So saying that they were liars, that they were, knowingly just creating a hoax or creating a fake message, it doesn't match with their skepticism that's recorded. Okay, well, the bell rang, so we'll cover the last couple of these, and then next week is the gospel meeting, so we'll have a bit of a breather from this. I will put out questions by Sunday, so you'll have a week to look at those. Thank you for your time this evening.